Okay, we're now going to derive the aggregate demand inflation adjustment model that's used to describe economic fluctuations. You recall, this is a model which involves two curves, AD for aggregate demand, IA for inflation adjustment, where the axes are real GDP and the inflation rate. So we want to start by deriving the aggregate demand curve, this downward sloping relationship between inflation and real GDP. It tells you that when inflation goes down, real GDP tends to go up. We want to understand how this occurs and how it helps us explain the economic fluctuations in the economy. To derive the aggregate demand curve, it's useful to think of really three stages in the derivation. What our objective is to look at the relationship between the inflation rate, represented by the box on the far left in this diagram, and real GDP, represented by the box on the far right. There's going to be two stages in our analysis. First, we're going to look at the impact of the interest rate on GDP. And to be precise, we want to look at the real interest rate and real GDP, in both cases, adjusting for inflation. The second stage, is to look at the effect of the inflation rate on the interest rate, or on the real interest rate. Once we have those two steps, from the inflation rate to the interest rate, and then from the interest rate to real GDP, the third stage is just to combine the two and get this relationship between the inflation rate and real GDP, as represented by the blue line connecting the two boxes at the bottom. So there's quite a lot going on, especially when you have to put all these things in your head at the same time. This little picture is an attempt to try to make this a little easier. So let's get on with stage one. In stage one, we want to show why real GDP is negatively related to the interest rate. Why is this the case? Well, it's actually something that we talked about in the model of spending allocation as well, the spending allocation model. And it begins with the idea that GDP is equal to consumption plus investment plus net exports plus government purchases. We've seen this several times before. And then reminding ourselves that consumption, investment, and net exports all depend negatively on the interest rate. And we've discussed this in different contexts. But recall, consumption depends negatively on the interest rate because a higher interest rate really makes future consumption relatively cheap. You can put your money away and get a higher return. So future consumption becomes relatively less expensive. And so people will reduce their current consumption and try to increase their consumption in the future. So consumption goes down when the interest rate goes up. Some investment, the mechanism more has to do with businesses, because businesses are doing the investment. They're buying new trucks or they're building new factories. And to the extent that these expenditures on trucks or factories are financed by borrowing, the higher is the interest rate on the loans that the businesses has to pay, the less investment they're going to do. So a higher interest rate reduces the amount of investment that firms do as well. And then finally, net exports. Recall that's a little more involved here because net exports depends on exports minus imports. And the connection between the two has to do with, therefore, with international considerations and with exchange markets in particular. So when the interest rate rises, say in the United States, investors are going to increase their demand for US dollars. They may be coming from Europe or Japan or South America to get higher interest rates in the US if they're higher. So if interest rates are higher in the US, it's going to increase the demand for dollars. It'll bid up the value of the dollar. The dollar will appreciate. And what that's going to do is make US exports more expensive. And so it's going to reduce the quantity demanded of exports. It reduces net exports, but it's also going to make imports into the US a little cheaper, so that increases the demand for imports. And so on both accounts, net exports are going to go down when the interest rate goes up. So net exports are negatively related to the interest rate. And the same works in reverse. So this is kind of a review of things that we've considered already. And it's useful to be able to apply that same kind of ideas, which are really very fundamental in economics, to this model we're developing now. So the sum of this story, in fact, the sum of the variables, is that Y is negatively related to the interest rate because consumption, investment, and net exports are all related to the interest rate. We're not going to worry too much about government purchases depending on the interest rate. Those are determined by, say, issues related to national security or the importance of education, things that are less related to the interest rate than the other three. So we'll take government purchases as relatively unrelated to the interest rate for that reason. Also makes the analysis a little simpler, and in many cases we're going to try to look at the effect of a change in government purchases on GDP in the short run. So you can represent this stage one using the expenditure line in the 45-degree line diagram that we considered before. So in this case, you have the 45-degree line, spending and income on the axis, and the light green line, the green line at the top here, that represents aggregate expenditures, the E line, say at a starting point. And then you can suppose that interest rates rise, suppose interest rates are higher in the economy, just suppose that's the case. Well, that's going to drop down the expenditure line, cause that expenditure line to go down, because remember, investment will go down with a higher interest rate, and net exports will go down with a higher interest rate, and consumption will go down with the higher interest rates. That all shifts down and shifts the expenditure line down, as shown by the arrow pointing downwards. And this is going to cause the intersection to move from here over to here, and therefore the level of GDP to go down from here to here, and that decline represents the negative relationship of real GDP and the interest rate. Because remember, what we just did was increase the interest rate, and we found that real GDP goes down. So that's really a way to represent this first stage of the analysis of the derivation of our aggregate demand curve. In stage two, we're looking at the interest rate and how it is related to inflation. In this case, we're going to argue that the interest rate is positively related to inflation. And this part of the story has to do with the Federal Reserve, which we've introduced already. We're going to argue that the Federal Reserve, the Fed, tends to raise its interest rate when inflation rises, and it tends to lower its interest rate when inflation falls. The reason it does this is the Federal Reserve, one of its responsibilities is to keep inflation from rising or falling too much. They'd like to have a target, maybe 2%. That's the current target for the Federal Reserve. So if inflation rises above that target, they will raise the interest rate, trying to cool down the economy, trying to get the inflation to sort of back to its target. Similarly, if it falls below the target, they will lower the interest rate, trying to add a little heat to the economy, trying to get the inflation to back up again. They make these adjustments through open market operations, which you'll recall are the purchases and sales of bonds in the open market. And you can think of the mechanism. There's many ways to think about why this happens, but the simplest way is just to remember that bond prices and interest rates are inversely related. And so therefore, if the Fed wants to lower the interest rate, it just has to buy bonds, because the buying of the bonds is going to raise their price, right? And the higher price is going to mean a lower interest rate. So the Fed can move that interest rate around. An easy way to think about it is what I just said. An open market operation entails buying bonds. Open market operations also entail selling bonds, and if the Fed sold bonds, it would drive down the price of bonds and be a way for the interest rate to rise. So in this way, and this is the mechanism, one of the mechanisms by which the Fed tries to adjust the interest rate. When we think about this relationship by the Fed and what the Fed's doing, you should think of it as a behavioral description of what the people at the Fed do, the chair of the Fed and the other people on the Federal Open Market Committee. It's a description of their behavior. In that sense, it's like a demand curve for bicycles or peanuts, where we looked at the behavior of consumers of bicycles and peanuts to figure out what the demand curve was. Here we're kind of looking at the behavior of the people at the Fed rather than people in the bicycle or peanut market, but the concept is very similar. We call this response, it has a name, the monetary policy rule. And that's what is going to be our connection, the stage two, between the interest rate and inflation. It's just the behavior of the Federal Reserve. We can represent this one graphically as well. Here's one attempt to do that. So we need to have the inflation rate and the interest rate. That's the relationship we're looking for. On the horizontal axis here, we put the inflation rate. On the vertical axis, we have the interest rate. And you can see it's upward sloping, simply reflecting that behavior of the Federal Reserve, in this case, as part of its duties to keep inflation under control. This is a simple description of how the Fed operates. Sometimes, as we'll see, it does other things as well. It maybe directly deal with a recession or a boom in other ways. So this is if you like, a simple example or a simple description of the Fed. It captures a lot of their behavior, but sometimes not everything. And so sometimes this curve can actually shift, and we want to investigate that possibility as well. So that's stage 2. Now stage 3. Stage 3 actually just puts these two stages together. So let's just suppose that the interest rate increases. Just imagine that the inflation rate increases. Suppose that the inflation increases. Then the Fed will raise the interest rate according to the monetary policy rule. The higher interest rate will decrease real GDP, as we've explained, by looking at how investment and net exports depend on the interest rate. And so that's the connection. Higher inflation, lower GDP. Inflation increases, decreases in real GDP. Goes the other way. Suppose that inflation decreases, then we argue the Fed will lower the interest rate. That lower interest rate will increase real GDP. That's the connection. Inflation decreases, causes an increase in real GDP. So this is this negative relationship, which is simply the aggregate demand curve. You can summarize this with some graphs, and so let's look at some graphs to do this. Call this more details on the 3 stages, just really some added emphasis to understand what's going on. So I've taken the graph called the monetary policy rule. I'll put it on the upper left. You see it's upward sloping with inflation on the horizontal axis and interest rates on the vertical axis. On the upper right, I have the 45-degree line diagram again with income or real GDP on the horizontal axis and spending on the vertical axis. Aggregate expenditure line shown in green. And at the bottom, I'm going to have the aggregate demand curve with real GDP on the horizontal axis and the inflation rate on the vertical axis. And our objective here, remember, is to derive that aggregate demand curve. So how do we do that? Well, we imagine there's an increase in the inflation rate. And that's shown in the box number 1. Suppose there's an increase in the inflation rate. We can mark that increase in the inflation rate as shown in box 2 in the lower diagram, the bottom, as an upward movement on the vertical axis because inflation is higher. Okay, so we mark that higher. Now, according to the monetary policy rule in the upper left, this higher inflation rate is going to mean a higher interest rate, and that's labeled in box 3. The interest rate goes up. Now, to switch over to the upper right, we see the higher interest rate reduces the expenditure line because investment's discouraged and net exports goes down. They all shift down. And according to the spending balance argument, which we know must be true, real GDP declines because you have an intersection at a lower level of real GDP. And then finally, you take that lower level of real GDP and you put it in the bottom diagram. You mark it on the axes because the axes in the bottom diagram coincides exactly with the axes in the upper right-hand diagram. And so you see that there is now a lower level of real GDP, and it's clearly now associated with the higher level of inflation. So box 7 shows you those 2 points. You connect the 2 points with a red line, and you have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. And of course, this argument holds all for many different points, many different inflation rates. You could raise them, lower them by different amounts, and all you're going to do is trace out different points along that red line. So that's really a summary of how we derive the aggregate demand curve based on the 3-stage argument. To use this model, we need to consider shifts as well as movements along the aggregate demand curve. What we've illustrated so far is the movements along the curve. We've shown what happens when there's changes in the inflation rate and that these cause real GDP to change. Those are the movements along the curve as we've illustrated with the diagram and with words. Shifts of the aggregate demand curve occur when changes in anything else cause real GDP to change. And so that could be a change in government purchases, which shifts the aggregate expenditure line. It could be a crisis, maybe a crisis in Asia or in Africa or Europe, which affects exports. Or it could be a change in monetary policy. It could be all these things. So we want to be sure that we know which curve to shift and which direction to shift in order to analyze the model. So for example, a shift in aggregate demand curve due to an increase in government purchases would look like this. Again, there's the aggregate demand curve. I'm illustrating 2 of them, one before the shift and one after the shift. The one before the shift is called old aggregate demand curve, and the one after the shift is called the new aggregate demand curve. And the shift just means that at the same level of inflation, real GDP has gone up. That's really that shift downward in the aggregate expenditures, which causes the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. Simply put, there's more being spent on real GDP at a given inflation rate, and so there's more being produced in the short run, and we're just going to represent that by a shift on this curve, shift over to the right in this particular case. We also can have shifts in the monetary policy rule. That's illustrated in this picture. A shift in the monetary policy rule is going to result in a shift in the aggregate demand curve as well. This is an example where the Federal Reserve decides to go for a higher inflation rate. So the monetary policy rule over on the left has lower inflation rates than the monetary policy rule over on the right. So suppose the Fed wants to shift from a target inflation rate of 2% to a higher level, maybe 3% or 4%, whatever it happens to be. That means at any given level of inflation, they're going to have a lower interest rate, so the interest rate falls as you shift that curve over to the right. And that decline in the interest rate is really what's going to now affect aggregate demand, because the higher interest rate increases the demand for, the lower interest rate, increases the demand for investment, increases the demand for net exports, etc., and that's a shift in the aggregate demand curve. So a shift in monetary policy shifts the aggregate demand curve, a shift in government purchases shifts the aggregate demand curve, and what we want to do is now use the model to figure out what actually happens after those shifts. What's the dynamic adjustment to the economy? And in fact, do some of those shifts help you get back to potential GDP? Or perhaps some of these shifts caused the recession in the first place? With this model, we'll be able to answer those questions. Thank you.